is just a welcome and introductions. And so why don't we, I think most of us or all of us know each other, but why don't we go ahead and just do a round of introductions of your name, and then maybe where you are in our state today, where you're joining us from. And so I can get us started. So Mercedes Jones, Director of Professional Learning with the Educator Advancement Council, and main role and responsibility is helping to support and facilitate the 10 regional educator networks across the state. Angela, I'll pass it to you.
Angela Bloom. What is my current title? My title never makes any sense to me. Educator Programs Analyst, but I primarily work and support the RENs as a grant administrator. And I'm here in Lebanon. Nobody knows where that's at. And then I'll pass it on to Sarah.
Good morning, everyone. Sarah Spencer, Interim Executive Director of the Educator Advancement Council. And I have been in Long Beach, California since November 19th due to a family serious situation with my brother-in-law who has broken his neck. And so we have been here and we are hopefully headed to Oregon Saturday, I think. So it's been a long ride being away from home. And I will kick it off to Andy.
Morning all, Andy Bales-Molnar. I work at the Department of Early Learning and Care. So I'm here both as a surrogate for our director, Alyssa Chatterjee, and also representing our Professional Learning System office. I also currently serve on the EAC as the chair. So I work statewide. I'm currently standing today in Portland. So happy to be here, and I will send it over to Becca.
Hey everyone, I'm Becca Subzalian, and my role right now, I'm an independent education consultant, but with a background in teaching and in, equity, professional development, and grant making. But right now I'm just working with NAEA solely doing a literacy program and then also revamping their leadership program, and happy to be here. I'll pass it to Jana.
I'm Jana Giles. I'm a third grade teacher at North Marion. I'm currently in Lake Oswego, and I'm the elementary director. Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa Hasawike. I am the 21st Century Community Learning Centers grant coordinator in my district. I just started November 30. New job, and I'm one of the K-12 directors, and I'm currently in Tigard. And let's see, I'll pass it to Michelle.
Michelle Oakes. I am currently in Bend the Pine, in Bend the Pine. I'm sitting here, I had to borrow again. I need a conference room, trying to find a spot because I'm like, I can't make it back to my office in time. And so I support all of our beginning novice educators in Ben Lapine schools. I also am state lead for National Board Certification and a director on EAC. And I will pass it to DJ. Thanks, DJ.
Hi, y'all. Preferred name DJ. I am the REN design team coach, and I am still serving as vice chair for the EAC and joining y'all from Douglas County. I'll pass it to Elizabeth unless she's still needing time. I can tell y'all, regale y'all with some stories if she needs some time.
Hi everyone. I'm actually done posting it and setting it up live stream. Well, I'm just here to live stream, but I can introduce myself. I'm Elizabeth, and I'm the executive assistant for the executive director of the Educator Advancement Council director. And I've been here for almost 5 years already. And I've been with ODE for almost 6 years. And I'm actually back from my almost 2-month long vacation in Mexico. I missed the snowstorm, thankfully. But I'm not happy about the rainy weather in Mexico. It was very sunny and warm, and I didn't want to come back, but I'm actually glad that I did. I kind of missed work and my husband and my dog. So yeah, it's nice to see you all again.
Great. Thank you, everybody. So I dropped the agenda into the chat, and here's, sorry, Director Oaks, I'm going to drop it again for you since you joined us. There we go. So to get us started, just looking at the agenda, and kind of what we have planned together for our time today. So we're together until noon, and we have quite a few things to get through. And so essentially, like I say at the beginning of this meeting, we do have to follow public meeting law. And so Elizabeth, did we get any public comment submitted?
No, no public comment submitted.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to drop in another document for you all. And if you could all open it, and I'm happy to share my screen also. Was everybody able to open that document? Okay, great. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen as we go through this. So to get us started, I wanted to kind of set the foundation around, what this work group is, what roles and responsibilities are, and really like the purpose and objective of us coming together in this REN work group. So the document that I just shared with you is, for your review, but the document really outlines what the purpose of this group is, which this group, I'm really hoping that we can start having conversations and discussions where you as EAC directors can start giving input and then eventually proposing full recommendations to the full council related to the revision and updating of the REN administrative rules, as well as developing and identifying statewide REN outcomes and metrics. And so there's kind of two pieces there. And so today we're really going to be focusing on the REN administrative rules and what some of the problems of practices are in relation to those. And so moving through that, so one of the ways that the EAC directors inform policy is through the administrative rules. And so that's one of the reasons why we're engaging you guys in this process as we go through and identify where some of those revisions and updates need to be made. And so on this slide, really just trying to outline kind of what the role and responsibility of EAC directors are in this process. And so, we're really hoping that by bringing together the multiple perspectives in this room, that we can do the update to the administrative rules that allows us to be flexible and responsive to the variance and needs across each of the regions. Let's see. And then some of these responsibilities, reading through here, before all of our meetings, we'll make sure that we send out any materials that need to be reviewed beforehand so that way you guys can come prepared. We're going to really focus on the policy making and, strategic direction and vision setting. Not so much the day-to-day operations, but helping you or giving you all opportunity and space and time to provide that input and strategic direction on how we are developing and designing REN implementation. And then kind of moving on. So I'm going to pass it over to Angela, and so she can kind of explain what we're hoping the process and timeline to look like while we are in our time together.
Thank you. Good morning. I just wanted to give you all a quick primer. If you are familiar with the rulemaking process, EAC has a slightly different one than you may be familiar with. So if we go to the first slide here, that first figure is the pathway required for a rule change to take place within the EAC. And the grid is the steps and time anticipated to reach each of these milestones. So according to DOJ, the EAC sits in some gray area regarding its ability to do its own rulemaking. So as such, we currently utilize ODE's process and staff for rulemaking. The first figure shows this integrated process where the EAC has some time to work on the rules, and then it switches over to the ODE process after the rule is adopted by the council. And the grid articulates sort of the steps in between each of these milestones and the anticipated kind of draft timeline to reach each of them. So that's kind of the timeline that we're working with. Once we finish the EAC side of the work, ODE's rules team and advisory council take over, and their process takes about 60 days. And most of that is wait time. It takes a while to get on the agenda. It takes a while to do the filings, all those things with Secretary of State. So they follow their process. And these last two bullets are the quickest part of the timeline. So once the state board officially adopts the rule, filing with the Secretary of State's office and publishing is just a matter of days. So moving to the second slide is a kind of a zoomed in version of the time. So our tentative timeline for this process, which is I just want to emphasize that this is a tentative timeline and is really going to be based on the availability of folks in this workshop and the time that you're able to make available to meet with this work group to draft recommendations. So next week we'll inform the council formally of the work plan for this group, and then after that, with any luck, we'll meet again in parallel with REN staff as they're getting informed on this process, and once or twice in February. And then the intention is to work with between directors and EAC staff and with input from the RENs to create a mutually informed set of recommendations by March, the March 6th EAC meeting. And we anticipate the council will vote to approve recommendations made by the work groups and hope to be able to send those on to the ODE rules administrator within about 24 hours of approval to start the 60-day ODE process. So if this timeline works, the filing with the Secretary of State's office should happen around May 17th. I think I saw something in the chat. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so kind of going back to like what the objectives that we're hoping to accomplish with this work group is, one, the updating of the administrative rules. And then also just a note for you all, the other stream of work is around identifying and developing out the statewide outcomes and metrics for the RENs. And so we are going to be we're working right now to bring on a vendor to help us lift up that work and develop out a process. And so that'll be kind of the other stream of work that comes to this group as well. Okay. So before we jump into what the problems of practice are that we're hoping to start having some discussions and conversations around, I wanted to revisit and kind of give the outline around, what is an administrative rule? Some of this information might be familiar or might seem repetitive. It was also shared at one of our EAC full council meetings when we learned about the legislative process from our legislative coordinator within ODE. But essentially, administrative rules are what agencies and boards and council use to interpret the statutory authority. And the statutory authority is taken from the Senate bill that created us. So I will share this slide deck with you all after our meeting. And so everything is linked in here as well. And so the administrative rule, though, is really what helps us to be able to clearly know and understand what it is that our initiatives or programs are intended to do and operate. And so within our REN administrative rules, we have various sections around that outline processes and rules about the criteria of how we select regional educator networks. We have sections around capacity dollars and formula dollars and member organizations. So we'll be, really going through each one of these sections in terms of, where we need to have conversation and discussion around on how we best update those rules and sections to better support our regional educator networks. Any questions about administrative rules before we move into conversation? Just doing the awkward teacher wait time is all. Okay, hearing none. So our problem of practice that we're really going to be diving into today and having continued conversation around, like I said, are really around the administrative rules. The last time that our administrative rules for the RENs were updated is when they were written back in 2019. And so you can imagine now that our RENs have been, in implementation since then, we've learned a lot. As well as our sponsoring organization and the role and responsibility of them in hosting the RENs, just also in general, just how much the RENs themselves have evolved. And so there are sections and topic areas within these administrative rules that we have identified as really needing some discussion and conversation around so that we can better understand how best to start, like what revisions look like on those rules. So today is really going to be focused on, engaging you all in a discussion so we can start gathering information to help inform, the revision of this. So this is really, our first meeting is really around just kind of information gathering and having discussion and asking questions. Any questions about that before we move? Okay. So our hope is that we get through at least two of the sections of administrative rules that need some discussion and conversation around so that we can gather that information. We've outlined a protocol for a couple of different reasons. One, to help keep us on track and on time and on schedule, but also trying to help us keep honed in and really framed around the questions, the essential questions that it is that we're really trying to better understand. So the way in which we'll introduce the problem of practice and share a little bit about, some of the challenges and impacts that we are noticing. And then we'll open it up for you all to start, asking some clarifying questions around, the who, what, and where type of questions. And then we'll get into some of the why questions and really honing in on we'll pose some essential questions that'll help guide some of these conversations. So I'm really hoping that a lot of us moving forward is a lot of you all talking and us doing a lot of the listening and answering any questions that you guys have as we start to engage.
I also want to share the link to the notes document. I'm going to be taking notes as we go. And if I incorrectly transcribe something, please correct it.
Awesome. Thanks, Angela. Okay, before we jump into just one problem of practice, though, I did want to walk us through the 5 different ones that we have identified And so these are really based on the sections within the administrative rules themselves. So the very first kind of topic and the very first problem of practice that we'll start having conversation and discussion around is around the process and selection of sponsoring organizations to host RENs. So currently our rules right now articulate that we have to establish a request for application each biennium. And so we'll jump, like I said, we'll jump more into kind of what the challenges are and why this is a problem of practice that we've identified and have more conversation around. The second one is around a gap that we have identified in our rules, which is around, we do not currently have a process or criteria articulated in the event that we receive a request to create a new REN. So that's something that, you know, I'm hoping that these are the first two problems of practice that we'll be able to get to today. And then in our future meetings, we are going to need some conversation and discussion around the capacity grant allocations and trying for us to better understand the intent of a one-size-fits-all approach in the, you know, amount that is allocated to each of the RENs, and some of the challenges and barriers that RENs are experiencing due to that funding model. Another section that needs revision is around the member organization. And member organizations for RENs are the school districts that are eligible to be a part of a REN. And so those are the districts that RENs are responsible for serving. And in our rules, there are two options for member organizations. They have an option to opt out of a REN entirely. We do not currently have a process articulated that identifies what next. If that is the case, what is our responsibility as a council to ensure then that those educators in that, you know, area in that district are receiving support? And then same goes for, we have an option where districts can ask for reassignment to a different REN. And we are missing criteria for when and if that happens as well. So the last part is really around reporting and the REN plans that each of our RENs are responsible of submitting to us every biennium. And so we don't have an articulated process and criteria for approval or for accountability that are part of that. So you can see that, you know, when our RENs were very first launched, a lot of these rules were written to reflect that moment in time. But like I said, as they have evolved and as they have grown, and as we've learned more about them, we've been able to identify where there are some gaps within our rules or where we need clearer articulation of how to respond and be responsive to certain instances may they arise. Yes, Chair Bales Molnar.
Thanks, Mercedes. I'm curious, do we also have a gap in if a REN has been granted to a backbone board organization and it's not that we're not creating a new REN and the member organization is not opting out or the backbone is not opting out, but we are feeling like this is not the right place for this REN and we want to take that grant back out for bid. Is that part of these processes, or is there a rule somewhere like we have that so we don't need to think about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I want to clarify just so we have shared understanding. So and correct me if I'm wrong. I believe you're asking, do we have a current process for if a sponsoring organization who is hosting a REN is not working out for one reason or another? Do we have a process then to be able to select a new sponsoring organization? Okay, that is absolutely a part of this very first conversation, because that is a gap that we have.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I wanted to make sure that I knew all that was involved in that. And it's not just if we suddenly decided we need 25 different RENs. So great. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes. And so, and part of this process and some of the essential questions and information, I'm really happy that we have Director Oakes with us, because she is one of like our holder of historical knowledge and information of the RENs. And so, which I think is a really important piece of being able to understand where we were, where we currently are, and where we need to go, and what some of the original intent was.
I also want to call out that Director Oaks has dropped a comment in the chat. So the comments, RENs coordinating bodies must have certain membership. What if they don't? Does this impact them? I don't know if that is a rule issue or a policy, like an internal policy a thing to address.
Yeah, and I think that is a really great question, and one that we hope to start to have conversation and understand more about the member organization component of the rules and what engagement a member organization looks like. Absolutely.
Director Oaks, I'm going to drop that at the bottom of our POPs notes so that we can circle back around and discuss whether that becomes a POP or if it's a different level of conversation.
Thank you, Angela. I wasn't sure if it fit in one of these areas or if it was a separate one.
I'm not sure either. Dive in a little bit to figure that out.
Director Sabzalian.
Yeah, thank you. I am curious if one of the steps in this discussion is kind of like a little bit of presenting the landscape right now, as far as like giving us somewhat of a background on, because my understanding is like all the RENs are housed in ESDs right now, right? Those are sponsoring organizations, but I know there's other eligible organizations, right? So just kind of like giving us a picture of where we're at, so then we know why these problems of practice are actually the ones.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So once we start on a problem of practice, yeah, I will share more of like the context setting so that you have that information. And then, I'll turn it over to you all to, start asking some more questions of, maybe there's something missing or what have you. So absolutely. Is there any other wonderings or questions just in terms of like this high level overview of kind of what of our focuses are going to be as we start moving? Or if there's wonderings around maybe other things that might be missing? Okay.
I do have something. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I was like trying to think of how to phrase it. I'm still trying to think of how to phrase it. Is there a plan, or are we going to bring in some RENs or people representing RENs to come and share with us what their experience is, kind of like what Director Sabzalian was saying about where we're currently at? Can we hear from them as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So our plan, and I think Angela spoke a little bit to this in kind of our timeline and process, is first, we wanted to engage you all and do some, information gathering, some sense making around these current problems of practice. And then after we did all of that, we were then going to start engaging our REN coordinators and our sponsoring organizations in these same conversations as well, because I think that part of the administrative rulemaking process is making sure that we are engaging multiple perspectives, right, to help inform and also have a very transparent process. So yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry if she already said that. I was getting my notebook. So thanks.
No worries. All right. Any other questions?
Maybe just an additional comment to that, because I think you asked specifically if you would be able to hear from the RENs. And one thing that we were just discussing right before this meeting, sorry, there's been a lot of scrambling to sort of update our processes because we didn't realize that this was going to need to be public. But one thing that we talked about was potentially having the second work group meeting in February be a combined meeting. So after we get all the input, drafts and things, and then bring everybody together to work through the drafts.
Thanks, Angela. Okay. Okay, so here we are at 11:07. So we have just a little over 50 minutes to start engaging in some of these conversations. And so kind of going back to timeline and process, at the very end of this meeting, I'll kind of go over some next steps, but just as a recap of that timeline and process, we will be scheduling 2 meetings for February. So I'll be sending out a doodle poll to you all so we can identify when those meeting times will be. So that way we can get through and work through these conversations. So that's kind of just thinking forward. I don't want us to feel like we're rushing through. And so I just want you all to know that there's going to be additional meeting times and stuff for us to continue to work through these problems of practice. Okay, so jumping into our very first one, which is around our current rule that articulates that we have to establish a request for application each biennium. It is a competitive process. And in the past, you know, we have made sure that we have done this, and each time we have experienced that it has caused inefficiencies, delays, and inequities within our sponsoring organization and our grant agreements, as well as impacting how our RENs are able to implement the work that they are charged to do. So each 10 of our RENs right now are hosted and live within a ESD. And so an ESD is our sponsoring organization when we use that term. The request for application within ODE usually takes 9 to 12 months. Many of you might know that with our Grow Your Own programs, it took 2 years. So it is a significant amount of time for us to be able to do an RFA, or a request for application. So I'm curious from you all if it's helpful for me to share like kind of our experience as EAC staff in terms of like the impacts and challenges as it relates to this problem of practice, or if you guys would like to start asking some like probing questions of like what you need more information on.
Maybe we should start with the clarifying questions about the statement you just made.
Sure, yeah.
If anything unclear, since that's our protocol, about that statement.
Mine is not a clarifying question as it is just what Mercedes said. All of us in education know that the 2-year grants cause issues. And by, like Mercedes said, by the time you launch it, for instance, the mentor grant, you're going to be in year 2 before anyone gets money around that. So by having this, I do think there are probably more hindrances than the intended positive pieces that were supposed to be in place when that was originally written. And we were probably just following everybody else. Every other grant is always a 2-year biennium grant.
Yeah, I would echo what Michelle, Director Oak said, and Mercedes. Coming from our experience over at DELC, we understand that the 2-year grant can have a lot of challenges on it, even if you do have the availability to renew the grant without the competitive process. But that competitive process is incredibly intensive on both sides. And then the work of the REN just becomes that. And so I would absolutely support changing this rule. So any clarifying questions I have is probably down the road in the protocol around like what specifically is being described as a competitive application. Is there language in there that would allow us to say if they met in their performance period already met a certain amount of milestones, that's the competition, not that we have to go out for a full RFA or RFP for those. But just like, how do we move that forward to be able to demonstrate the accountability piece, which I'm sure is the spirit and the intent of the rule, and the equity piece that public funds that are being used are being followed up on. And if they're not, that there are adjustments made without it becoming so burdensome that really RENs are spending most of their time and their money that we're giving to them asking for more time and money. So it feels like an ineffective cycle. But I know that that biennium piece can be a tricky thing to overcome in terms of creating grants that cross the biennium through their funding. Some people have done it. Preschool Promise did it recently, and perhaps there's lessons we can learn there from them too.
I would also like to add, if you haven't looked at administrative rules, the Educator Advancement Council may revoke a REN's sponsorship. And so is the competitive piece still necessary now that we have 10 standing RENs?
I think that's a really good point. And so right above that section, and I think these two are connected and related. So you're absolutely right, Director Oaks. There is a rule that states that the council itself may revoke the status of a REN if they are not essentially in compliance with all of the requirements of the RFA and the rules itself. We also, that's an area of a gap that we have, that we do not have a process or criteria articulated for what that would look like or how we would even engage in that process.
I'll just jump in and say, I know that it's a capacity drain on both sides internally with the EAC and with the sponsoring organization, and we want them to be doing much more than this, right? This isn't what we want their time to be spent on. So I'm definitely in support, but I do have a lot of questions. It's helpful to know that there isn't a process for if we wanted to, revoke a sponsoring organization's role. And I think that there's a lot of other questions to understand for us, at least for me, as far as how would that work, funding allocation, how would that work if we moved away from the biennium, knowing that, that's how allocations are made via the legislature. So I just have a lot of questions, but I have a lot of support.
So maybe now is the time so if we don't have any other clarifying questions around like the problem of practice itself, maybe we move into some of the probing questions for you all to gather some more information. This is also, I think, a time for us to be gathering some questions that might be helpful for DOJ to give us some consultation on too, around what we can and can't do, the legality too piece of this as well. So is it okay if I take down my share screen so I can actually see you all? Or are you guys, is it helpful to have this slide up?
Is
Okay.
it possible for you to share the slide deck and then
Yes.
we can take the,
Yeah, that'd be great.
thank you.
Sure. Give me one moment.
Just as an FYI, so the statement that was at the top of that slide is also on that notes sheet at the top of the block where you see POP, and then it says current process requires a competitive application, etc. Just if that's helpful.
Okay, here we go. Here's a copy of the slide deck for you guys for reference. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to you all to start asking some of those, probing questions to gather more information, to better understand the problem of practice. And we'll listen and take notes. And if I'm able to provide some more information to your question, I will do that too. And if it's helpful, I think that Chair Bells Molnar brought up a good question earlier around what do we do or how are we responsive if we are hearing, some conversations or getting requests for a change in sponsoring organization. How are we responsive to that? And I do believe that through this rule, there is an opportunity for us to revise so that we can be responsive in that way. So maybe that's a place that we start as well. So I'm going to turn it over to you all to start kind of asking questions and having discussion.
I guess I still have a request in kind of context, like, I have a sense of the EAC staff and what a drain this is on you all. And then I'm just curious, what's the feedback been from the sponsoring organizations? How often has there been a request for, or how many times have there been some sort of complaint, or has there been any requests to transition, for an organization to move to a different rent? Like, how much has this come up?
Sure. Well, so in terms of the request for application itself, so we've had to do this every biennium since the RENs have launched. It has, you're absolutely right, draining on both sides. So because of the lift and the amount of time that it takes for us to go through the procurement process, to even get an RFA developed and then sent out and released, is very, very time consuming. Our feedback that we have gotten from the RENs is oftentimes filling out the actual application and doing the heavy lifting of completing that itself. Our REN coordinators are often tasked with, which is also very time consuming, because the applications themselves are pretty lengthy. The additional thing that ends up happening, and that has happened in the past, is that because the RFA process takes so long, no matter how early we start, we end up running into a problem where our grant agreements actually have expired, and we've had to ask and request for amendments, which amendments also take quite a long time. So it ends up putting a burden on our RENs, especially our smaller sponsoring organizations, with funding, because then it creates the instability of being able to actually spend down REN dollars. If our grant agreements are expired, or if we're in a transition period of we're asking for, amendments for those contracts.
I want to clarify that point with some specifics. So, for example, we have some RENs that have they have much smaller operating budgets. So 500,000 versus 7 million is a pretty big difference. So those organizations struggle a lot more to carry costs. So if you weren't familiar with the mechanism that ODE uses, it's on a reimbursement basis for grants. So that means the ESD, the sponsoring organization, has to provide those RENs with funding up front and then apply for reimbursement through the expenditure and invoicing process. So these organizations that run on much tighter budgets and have very little in-between space, they have to carry those expenses for however long it takes for us to finish the procurement process. And so it becomes a real struggle for them to be able to continue to conduct operations when their ESD is already really tapped for funding.
My understanding as well is that the RENs often or sometimes reimburse the schools or districts for the change ideas they're doing. So then that burden of waiting for the money to come in and be secured is put on the schools, and that really strains the different institutions, the teachers, the administration, the money that directly is being used on students, and the trust being developed between the RENs and those organizations.
So that's kind of the RFA component of this. But in terms to your other question though, Director Sabzalian, around, if we've received requests before to change sponsoring organizations, there have a lot really since I came into this role in 2020, late 2020, and we've never received a formal request, but there have been instances where there have been a lot of discussions that there were either districts or member organizations or coordinating body members who wanted to explore the possibility of changing sponsoring organizations for various reasons. The formal request itself has never actually come through. But that's not to say, right, that as these RENs grow and evolve, that may happen. And so how do we be prepared? Especially, I think, to Director Oaks' comment that we do have a rule, right, that states that the council can revoke a REN status. Kind of then what do we do?
I have a question related to that. Is there any kind of communication, or what's the transparency like between when something like that comes up and then the sponsoring organization and the member organization, or that have brought up the request, informal request?
Yeah, so we've only had one actual instance of that happening, and it was more so a conversation and exploration between two partnering ESDs who were wondering and exploring what it would look like for the other ESD to essentially assume responsibility for that REN. So again, full transparency, they were able to work out and create an MOU to delineate, the roles and responsibilities of that partnership. And that met everybody's needs. So they were able to work through it on their own. So we didn't have to engage in a legal process of what that would actually look like if it went through.
I'm kind of thinking, I'm trying to hold all these things together, so y'all get to kind of go on my processing ride with me. But I want to just emphasize, I think that the strongest reason to consider a recommendation of not repeating a full repetitive process every 2 years is what you brought up, Mercedes, around the delay it causes in grant execution. And knowing that is an ongoing issue that has impacted partners and communities across the state, as DJ has said, but also something that has risen to the attention of the governor's office and is incredibly important. And I know a priority of hers to improve that customer service and to be able to ensure that funds are there when we're asking work to start. It is not without a grant that's fully executed, there is no obligation for any work to be happening. But unfortunately, it also means that there's no obligation that the staff that work is funding to be retained. And so it really does have some serious consequences in community. And so I know that the governor has been really encouraging the state system to look at how quickly those funds get out as part of customer service, but also just part of ensuring those services, the continuity of services, which to me is like revoking the competitive process or redefining what the competitive process looks like feels a little bit different than what it would be to revoke a REN from a board organization or sponsoring organization. I apologize. We use backbone a lot. And so again, like we all do the same work, but we use different words just for fun, I guess. And so that to me, that's part of like monitoring, and there are a lot of considerations and individual cases too. So I think that there's also DOJ would probably give us a lot of information about just how do you revoke a grant in general.
Absolutely.
And also I would just add part of that individualization is looking at the community, and are there others there who would be able to stand up a REN, who would be able to absorb the current work. I think that that is a much more complicated situation than being able to redefine what competitive process looks like.
Right. And just very quickly, Director Oaks, because I know Director Subzalian had asked this question, ESD school districts, tribes, federally recognized tribes, and our public universities, or a combination thereof, any of those are all eligible to be a sponsoring organization for a REN. But I think your point earlier, though, was really speaking to the work that the RENs have been charged to do requires stability in doing that, right? And so thinking then about, I would not imagine that we would take it lightly if there was a request to change sponsoring organizations, because that does then run the risk, right, of instability for different reasons. But Director Oaks, I'm so sorry that I interrupted you.
No, you were fine. Just going back to Chair Bells-Molner's point is, I think we need to define what is our why. What is our why around a application process every 2 years? That will help us define whether or not it needs to be competitive or how else we might change it, and if we can change it. But what's our why? What is it we hope to get from the RENs themselves and other entities out there every 2 years?
Director Oaks, I'm wondering if you remember some early conversations. I think you may have been, I wasn't sure if you were one of the members that were more deeply embedded in those conversations early on, but I was around for a short time while Hilda was starting to work on building structures and roles, and then the transition to Shandine, and while Cheryl was there supporting the rules. And what I remember is some conversation about the intentionality of where the relationship between the staff and the RENs is. I think the original intention was to run this more like a traditional grant program where the staff was much more hands-off, and the grants functioned as a funding stream that then filtered back to the state once or twice a year in the way of reports on progress and with specific metrics in mind. And so my thought is that it makes sense that our other competitive grant processes are built that way, to have a mechanism in place to pull a grantee that isn't producing the results that we were expecting, right, to be able to assign it or award it to somebody else who could produce the results. So that was just my recollection from some of those early conversations, was along the lines of maybe that the original intent of the grants in terms of what the structure looked like is a little different than the reality of what our RENs currently are. But maybe you remember more about those conversations.
Well, and what you said, Angela, to me seems like, so we have the ability to revoke. So therefore, do we need What's the why behind a 2-year competitive process, grant process? I know why it was put in before. That's neither here nor there. As of today, what's our why? What's this group's why around that?
Yeah, good question for today, for sure. Just in the past, I don't know which one was put into place first. So it could have been that it was a duplicative effort to get accountability.
And in the past, it was put in because we didn't know who was going to even apply. So that's why it was put in, and we didn't know if when the sponsoring organization applied, how did we give them an out? How did we give that change? What did that look like? And yes, unfortunately, Mercedes, there's a lot of stuff that got put in with no processes, but it was good thinking. And so this is one of those things though. And our goal was to move away from competitive grants in general, hence why RENs were created. And so I'm with Andy in the sense of, do we need the competitive grant part? Do we need it every 2 years? Maybe it's every 4 year instead of every 2. I don't know. So those are the questions. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the wonderings that I have is, I think it sounds like there's consensus around we need language in this rule that allows for the flexibility to do an RFA if needed. But then what would be the instances or situations or criteria, if you will, that would trigger, right, that process?
I don't know if
Sarah?
I was just going to add that this is a perfect example of why we're having this conversation, and I appreciate all of the input because it makes me wonder, and I've been through this process with procurement in a lot of different spaces and roles, and it's not unfamiliar. And so it does beg the question of, should we be doing grant amendments after the end of a 2-year to amend for another 2 years, rather than being in this constant churn of you're spending really, like we said, the second year trying to get the funding, they're finally able to utilize it. And then we're back in that the next year on the hamster wheel, trying to get everybody's money back out. And so I'm wondering whether we do a 2-year, but there's an amendment. So it actually ends up being 4 years so that there's more time to really get the train moving, because it feels like we keep disrupting, and I'm stating the obvious, but I just wonder about whether a 2-year amend in the middle, which could be a really small exercise in terms of getting RENs what they need, and then at that end of 4, maybe going back to that. That's just an idea, but I think this is exactly why we're having this conversation, because we're having some growing pains, which is kind of a good problem to have.
Because we're in a public space, I need to read the comment that Chair Molnar made in chat, which is, I would agree that having it every 5 to 10 years is a good idea. It can be a way to make adjustments and clarify expectations.
And I'm happy to, Angela, I forgot about that part. So if ever you want to just invite me to read what I've said, I can do that too. I apologize. I will be more conscious of that.
I agree. It seems like a revoke seems different than an application process, right? Where then there's a denial if there's been problems. So it seems like, 2 years, I think it's clear that that's not working on capacity on both ends. And even with the capacity drain, is it necessary if we're talking about building trust too, right? We want it to flow. We want there to be trust that that the relationships are being established via the membership organizations, via the sponsoring organization, and the sponsoring organization to the EAC. So that to me seemed like clearly the 2-year isn't functioning in the way we want it to. But I do think, some application process, a longer span makes sense because a revoke seems very different than a competitive application process. So that's just my thoughts.
Yeah, this is so helpful. And so one I'm hearing is there's agreement that the 2-year RFA process is actually hindering us in the ability to create stability for the RENs and creating like the conditions and the container for them to be able to do their work and serve the educators in their region. And then I also have heard a couple of questions that we should probably, Angela, I'm hoping that you have them in your notes that we need to take to DOJ and ask, what is within the authority of the council to do in terms of that process as well.
Specifically the revoking.
No, I think within the RFA process itself.
All the RFA, okay. I'm gonna.
And possibly adding an amendment, like Executive Director Spencer said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think part of that is like a procurement question in consultation with DOJ.
And I'm curious what would be the preference, right? Like, can the question be, if the preference of the council is to just make it every 5 years, right? Just do an extended time frame or 4 years, and then is the secondary option the amendment option, right? Or is that what we want to go with first? I think that's a good question to ask. Because I think what I would prefer is that we just extend it, right? That there would be an extended time frame, knowing that we've already talked about the amendments are time consuming as well, that there's, there's some capacity that's taken in that process too. So is that our first, would our first be, I think you understand what I'm saying.
Director Juarez?
Yeah, I am not opposed to the extending the time period there. I'm just wondering and starting to think about what, I guess, that root cause analysis. Is it the manpower, or is it the actual application that is maybe very tedious, and so beyond just extending how often, or the iterations of this process, thinking about the application itself, and maybe if there is a way to streamline it or make it easier. I'm in my mind imagining those situations where you're filling out a job application and you submit your resume and then ask you to list everything. And I'm not saying that that's what this application process is like for RENs, but if we can clean that up and make it more user-friendly so it doesn't continue to cause a strain, because I think there's an opportunity there for improvement.
Sure. Thank you for that.
I would agree. I think there's multiple pain points though, right? It's like the application is a big lift, but then there's the procurement process, and then there's which causes all the delays and the waits, and then causes instability. So it's not just the application is tedious. There's, even though I'm sure that could be better. I have no doubt that could be refined. I don't think that's the only thing that's prompting us to have this discussion.
I know we only have 20 minutes left. And I'm wondering to continue this conversation, to add another layer to this problem of practice, which is the second one. And let me share my screen. Whoops, let me share my screen one more time. Is in this conversation, is, currently as part of this process, we don't have a way to be responsive to a request of starting a new REN. And so again, kind of going back to, you know, one of the way that we do establish or we identify a sponsoring organization, and the way that our RENs were originally established was through this RFA process. And so like we have wonderings then around, you know, why there were only 10 RENs, why that number was chose. And, you know, how do we be responsive then if we are receiving complaints or having conversations and discussions, right, around educator needs not being met, whether it's they are asking for reassignment to a new REN or starting their own REN, how do we be responsive to those needs? And do our due diligence as a council to make sure that we are, you know, continually assessing what those needs are and being responsive to them.
I'm interested in hearing more about why 10. I've always wondered that, honestly, and really what was the process to establish the borders of those 10 and how to align. Coming from early learning, I think about our early learning hub regions, which we've worked to align with our CCR and our regions, and that having REN regions align with that selfishly would be really great work and alignment in communities, to especially if we are focusing on our charge of seamless professional learning for all ages of children and professionals. So if anyone, and I hate to put Director Oaks back on the historical testimony stage, but if anybody has any insights of the original intent of establishing only 10 and how the borders were chosen, I'm very curious.
So my vague recollection on this is that it was original, like our original goal, our original why is how do we disperse funds across the state equitably. And then thinking about who. Now the early learning hubs did come up, and it came up at the end. And so I don't remember, I don't recall, I think it could have been either or. Had early learning hubs applied and that been more of the then maybe that's where it would have gone. The ESDs were the ones who applied as the sponsoring organizations. And I think that's the reason that piece, why it was ESDs over early learning hubs. There was that conversation though.
So are the borderlines of those regions established by the ESDs?
Sort of. I don't know if you're about to say something, Mercedes. I remember this part of the conversation. Did you want to say something?
I wasn't a part of those conversations. I can share what has been shared with me on how those borders were identified, as they are identified essentially by ESDs, but also the partnerships among ESD superintendents also. So for example, we have one region who is split. We have our South Coast to Valley region, right? And so they serve part of their region is in the Valley, and then the other part of their region is the South Coast area of Oregon. And so that's how that was established.
So as to the direct number 10, I don't know, but I remember we had overlay maps. I don't know if you all remember the regional achievement collaboratives. At one point, the chief education office where this work was generated had multiple networks happening at one time. So there were the STEM hub networks, there was the regional achievement collaboratives, and then overlaid on top of that were the early learning hubs. And when you looked at the borders of the individual networks that were happening across the state, they were very similar. There was some gray area where the lines are blurred for certain types of work, but there was a lot of you could see that they came together in very similar patterns. So when the information was released and we allowed ESDs to choose, or the sponsor orgs to choose their own partners, they ended up following those borders pretty similarly. And that's to be expected because those groups were already working together in partnership. So the RENs did establish their own borders, so to speak, but they, I should say, and they followed existing partnerships of other networks that were already in place.
I'm
And
really,
I don't-
I'm
sorry.
really curious if there's any, has there been any mechanism that the sponsoring organizations or their member organizations can give feedback? Like, does the EAC or REN coordinator do surveying to kind of understand what's the satisfaction kind of landscape, so that we have an understanding of like, are the 10 working out wonderfully? I know you have that one example that you were talking about, right? That it sounds like they came to an understanding, but you know, I have my own experience being on a coordinating body for the largest REN in the state. Very, very distinctly different member districts, you know, and regions, but I don't have a sense of what the satisfaction has been or what the need would be, to be really clear on how to have a new application process and what that demand would be as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. And so at this time, we don't have a mechanism that essentially like surveys the satisfaction of member organizations with the sponsoring organization, or the coordinating body with the sponsoring organization. And so that could be something that we consider.
So Angela reminded me perfectly, there were already networks in place, and that's the early learning hubs and the STEM hubs were part of that. But also the idea of, if we break it up too much, then we're just becoming districts again, going after the grant, and really wanted to support regional areas. Can we create a new REN? There's no reason, well, there is a reason, like it states 10. So that would be a longer process. That would be a more, amendment or new rule for that to create a new REN. But the one in particular that I think is probably the trickiest from a staffing standpoint too, is the one that is the North Coast and the South Coast, that one that splits. Because if we think about mileage and lodging and support, that one's a huge one on REN staff, and that becomes money. And so that would be one, if we were to consider adding another REN, is that one that we would consider. And I think that's part of it, is we would have to be strategic in not just a who wants to be a REN, but what geographical and financial implications does it have?
Yeah, and just to clarify, so current rules actually don't state a limit on the amount of RENs that can exist. Our RFA does state that that we were seeking applications for the 10 regions. So that's where that number comes up, but our rules themselves don't actually give us a limit. This is where the ambiguity comes in our rules, is we only have a process for through the RFA to establish RENs, but not create new RENs. And so I think, Director Oaks, you're getting at then what would be the situations or the evidence that would trigger us needing a process, or to go into a process to explore what is the benefit then of creating a new REN. So that's where the ambiguity in our rules are, is that it doesn't say that we can create a new REN, but it also doesn't say that we can't.
I appreciate that, Michelle. It was very helpful. And it makes me think of the question of like, one, going back to our why. If we were to create a new REN, what is the problem we would be trying to solve? And so, in our rules, how do we state that the creation of new RENs is specifically to address certain factors that we might identify as reasons why a new REN would be created? And also recognizing that the 10 we have now, if we were to create an 11th or a 12th, you're almost creating like a forced divorce in some regions. And one REN would then be shrinking. And what unintended consequences may come from that, but then also what impact does that have on the REN that is being shrunk, and what agency do they have in that decision too? Things to consider. Go ahead, Sarah.
Mercedes, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
I saw you start to. I was just going to add on that part of the 10 is not necessarily a magic number, but what feels like we need to pay attention to in the long term is that rural and remote districts and how they can access, because I think that's part of what is the magic of the regional approach, is that even if you're in a very small district, you have access to professional learning opportunities that might not exist otherwise. And so I just point that out as an obvious thing.
Yeah, and I think to that point, right, part of the role and like the statute authority for the council itself, right, is to be continually assessing that educators' needs are met. And I do agree with you, Sarah, that the regional approach is one of those ways to ensure that those, remote and rural districts who were not necessarily receiving supports and services in the past, that this is one way that they are supported. And so in the consideration, if there were to be a request to create a new REN, ensuring that there were, criteria and processes that really highlight and really just spotlight, right? What is the impact and the benefit of those educators then into ensuring that they are being served? And are they currently not being served? Is that why the request, right, is even coming through to begin with? And so really keeping the educators themselves front and center and part of that decision and process. So we have 5 minutes left of our time together. And so before I kind of wrap us up here, is there any other, any additional comments, wonderings, questions that anybody wants to put out into the space in terms of the first problem of practice that we spent a lot of time on, the biennial RFA competitive grant or competitive process, or this problem of practice around, how and why, what would we do if we were to receive a request to start a new REN? Is there anything else anybody wants to put out into the space?
I think, like, as we're thinking about creating a new REN, I think absolutely like satisfaction survey, but also would it actually be necessary to create a new REN, or would it be that if a district is unsatisfied, they can choose to opt out or reassign, which is also in the administrative rules part, right? So yes, I think we should have a process in place, but I think those two are going to go very similar. Do we need to create one, or do you just need to go reassign to a different one?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I also agree with what the chair said around what are the unintended consequences, and especially like the financial implications.
Thank you for that, Director Oaks.
I think picking up on that, and what I keep going back to is like, I want to hear from the RENs and I want to hear from the sponsoring organizations, kind of like what Director Septilian was saying about like satisfactory, like what is working, what is not working. I need a little bit more context from them to know like how to create these processes that are actually going to help them, and not, I don't know. I don't trust my own voice to be the only perspective to fix things. And so I want to hear from them, like what we could do. Do they feel like they want to split? Because like the ESD you guys are talking about, or not the ESD, sorry, the REN, the South Coast and WAC is the one I'm a part of. So it's like Willamette ESD. So do they want it split? Do they want more support? Like how could we support them? So I think just hearing from them would help me a ton with this whole conversation.
Yeah, and yep, I hear that and I completely understand. And so this part of the process is just like information gathering, asking questions, putting those types of needs out into the space so we can make sure that we are, getting those multiple perspectives to make the best and most informed recommendation. Absolutely. Director Juarez?
Yeah, what I strongly agree with what Director Giles just shared. Definitely think that this should be like there should be some kind of process or protocol for when these things come up, but it should include some kind of like really getting to know and understand what's going on and an opportunity to address or like make corrections or add support before I can't remember, I believe it was Director Bells-Molnar who said we move or jump to like a forced divorce because that may be the solution, but until we really understand what the problem is and try a few other solutions, we're just going to be repeating like processes and procedures that are already in place. And that my understanding is the EAC is really trying to be innovative and change the way that things have been done in the past.
Thank you. So to wrap us up in our last 2 minutes of time, this has been a really helpful conversation for me and hopefully for the rest of you in terms of just kind of like trying to better understand the landscape and the problem of practice at hand and what some additional information that is needed. So thank you for all of the conversation and the questions that you guys all put out into this space for all of us. So some next steps. We're gonna do a summary of our discussion and send it out to you all in a follow-up email, as well as some of the requests that we heard and the questions that were put out as well. And I'm also going to include a link to a doodle poll for you guys to go through and complete so we can identify 2 more meeting dates for next month to keep us on track and moving. So with that, anything else before we all log off and close out our meeting?
Just gratitude. Thank you all for the discussion. Thank you, Mercedes and Angela, for bringing us together and having a process, some structure for us. That's very helpful. So I really do appreciate all of this. And I know scheduling is challenging. So appreciations for taking that on too.
Thank you, everybody. This has been really helpful for us.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.